Hi everyone, this is Tim the Plane Man here, and welcome to Plane Time. So we're at an exciting point actually in the build of the Sopwith Pup microplane model plane from Dancing Wings Hobby, and that is we're about to paint. Some of you may not be interested in the painting. You don't need to paint this model. It builds out as a beautiful plane if you don't paint. This is the painting section. If you're interested in painting, then join us as we paint and make this into a really nice little model. So what we're going to start with is what I have here is the primed pieces that we're going to paint. We're going to paint the cowling. We're going to paint the wheels. We're going to paint the tail feathers, the elevator, and the rudder. And we're going to paint the front of the fuselage of the plane. And this is going to be, and the cowling is going to be a beautiful red. And if you're interested to see what I'm looking at, there's a beautiful video of a flying replica, full-size replica Sopwith Pup in the playlist that this video is in, where you can actually see how this looks on a real full-size plane. That was really what we're copying, where the front of the plane is red and it looks really sharp. There's some alternative planes where the front of the plane is silver, so I mean you can choose what you want to do. So we're going to make this red, and I think it's going to be very, very interesting. Before we actually start the painting, I just wanted to show you the technique that I used to make sure that the painting or the priming that I didn't actually cause the tail feathers, the elevator, and the rudder to warp. Because the balsa is very fine, it reacts to getting wet. And you can end up with a twisted balsa, which will affect the model when it flies. So what I did what I should have done in the beginning, which is just simply pin it down. I'm working here on a soft pin board, and so all I've done is taken the wax paper, which is there to pretty much stop any kind of nasty sticking on whatever is underneath, and then pinned with the pins in at an angle. And I'll pull them out as I'm working here to show you how that is. Pinned these down to hold it in place so that I end up with a nice primed surface on the board, and it will stick a little bit, but it actually peels off quite nicely because it's the wax paper, and as long as I'm careful not to break anything. There we go, peels up. And there we go. So that's the elevator, with one of the pieces of the actual elevator flaps has come off, which is fine because that's where it's supposed to come off anyway. I'm going to sand that a little bit, and that will be perfect. And I think if you can see this, that's perfectly straight. There's not a single twist or warp in there at all, which is exactly what we're looking for. I did the same thing with pinning that other part of the elevator and the rudder. So what I'll do next, I'll just sand that up to make it clean and ready to go, and then we'll come back and we'll do the paint. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of the sanding. It's really a lot of the same, so there's no need for you to see the whole thing. So I'm just going to do a little bit of sanding on the video so you can see how I do the elevator, which is basically the same approach that I've used already for the flaps on the elevator. So I'm going to do the rudder, the flaps on the elevator, and I'll do on the elevator itself, and I've already done on the fuselage, which is the goal of the primer is to make a nice smooth surface with a solid coating as an undercoat for the paint that's going to go on later. So the most important thing is really to get rid of any little bits of excess paint, undercoat that really have not come through on the paint job. And here's a good example. On this side of the elevator, I've actually done quite a nice job. There's a nice smooth finish on there, and there's not really much I'm going to need to do in order to sand that back. On this side, being a little bit excessive with the paint, and I think probably a little bit extra paint here in a couple of places or a little bit of undercoat where it didn't need to be, and And so what I want to do is basically just smooth it back so it's a nice smooth surface for painting. So what I've done, I've got my little sanding block here, and I'm using a 400 grain sandpaper. I tried a 150, which is much finer, and that was too fine. And do remember that, you know, this is not the perfectly smooth final coat, which is what the colored paint will be on the top. This is sort of the next below it. So a little bit of a rough surface, but a smooth rough surface with a 400 grain sandpaper should be about right to give a really nice smooth paint job. So what I'm going to do is pretty much just carefully rub the sandpaper over those areas of the rudder where I've got that little bit of extra primer that just makes the surface a little bit uneven. Sanding it back, focusing a little bit on where I've got those little bit of extra paint that I don't need. Now what I also want to do is make sure I've got the edges right, nice as well, because sometimes a little bit of extra paint sort of gathers itself around the edge. So here's a good example here where, well, actually what we have is we have a one of those little tags that's actually going to insert into the elevator, and what's happened here is with the tag that that a little bit of extra paint has kind of gathered in to the little corner there. So really what I'm actually going to do is take my little craft knife here, just very carefully, and just clear away that little bit of extra paint in there, so that and we'll probably have to do this after we paint it too, but in the end we do want to end up with that tag still being able to fit cleanly into the part of the elevator where it needs to go, so that we get a nice solid connection and join. And so same thing, just clean up where those tags are, scrape away potentially any little extra bit of paint along that surface. That's going to be an undersurface, no one will see that, so just want to make sure there's no extra paint there that's going to get in the way. And then sort of clean up around the edge here just to make sure it's nice and smooth with no little bubbles or nodules that that make it look a little bit well, not as beautiful as we'd want. Now what we can do, it's in some ways a little unnecessary because it is such a fine piece, is just put a little bit of a bevel on that edge, or a rounding on the edge. I had done that with the base balsa before I started, so I'm just sort of cleaning that up from the point of view of the primer, just to make sure that we've got sort of a fairly clean surface. Maybe it's a little picky because honestly you won't see it unless you use a microphone glass or you're an eagle eye. You can see that kind of thing across the room, or you pick it up and examine it very closely. Still, little details like that make you feel better yourself about how a model's going to look. So I kind of like the idea of doing that. So that's not too bad. I've got, you know, if I feel it, I can feel now that even though the paint looks a little uneven from a color perspective, is actually a very, it's just a little spot there which is a little uneven. As long as I can feel that that's a nice smooth surface, that that will be ready for painting, so that'll be fine. So I think we're done with that piece. And so now I'm going to do the same thing with the main elevator surface itself, and then I'll come back when we're ready to actually apply our first coat of paint. So the last little thing that we need to do before we start painting is just a touch of masking. And this is the masking tape that I've got. I picked it up from a local Michael's hobby store. It's not the same masking tape that you'd find in a hardware store, and as you can see it's quite thin, and it's also let's say easy to attach and remove, but also gives a very fine coverage. Hopefully we're going to stop any bleed that might happen. So what I've got to do, the only thing I need to mask, because what I've done with the elevator is I've actually removed that last piece of elevator that was that was connected there that needed to be removed anyway, because I want to actually finish the elevator flaps as white, and I'm going to do the elevator itself as green. I would have had to mask that, and it's much easier just to paint them as separate pieces, so that's what I'll do. So it leaves only one piece that needs masking, and that's the fuselage. And on the fuselage here, if you notice, I already have masked where just the front part, because I'm not going to paint the rest of the fuselage, just the front. And I've masked this piece here. But what I'm going to try and do is to paint the front this quite bright red color to try and match the metallic red that you can see on the real flying plane. And then the piece of fuselage here around the cockpit seems to be, from what I can see on the picture, seems to be wood. So I'm actually going to paint that a kind of a brown color to try and match the wood, and we'll see how that comes out. But what that means is that I've masked off this piece where I intend to paint everything here, but I want to paint the front red and the back brown. So all I need to do to make that happen, take a little tiny bit of masking tape here and just mask off that front piece that I'm going to want to paint red, and I'll do the red first. And also, just sort of thinking it through, I'm going to make sure I leave enough space so that I can actually get the overlap right when I want to mask the other way around for the brown, so that I don't end up having to sort of mask around these two little attachments here that actually attach the main wings on. Otherwise it's going to get very fiddly. So what I'm going to do is simply mask that piece there, and see if I can get my knife in here and cut that piece off cleanly. It doesn't have to actually be a nice clean cover, because it's already, you know, covering a piece of masking tape over the back there. Get it down nice and smooth on the primer there, so I don't get any bleeds underneath. But I am actually just going to paint the front part of the fuselage there. So there's your masking tape, and we're going to come back and I think we'll start with the fuselage. All right, painting red, the fuselage, the front of the fuselage. This will be 2 coats of paint, and so the first one might show through some of the white a little bit, might look a little pink. I know from testing, because as I mentioned before, I did this test cover before, that it took 2 coats to get the kind of color that I was looking for. So we'll do that, and we'll paint the cowling as well, because that's going to be the same color. So here we go. Let's just, I mean, there's nothing exciting about the paint, but you know, just one thing to point out, I suppose. I'm using a brush. Maybe an advanced model painter might be using an airbrush or a spray paint, but there's a lot more masking required. You've got to, you know, you'd have to mask out those lugs for the attachment of the, oh my goodness, got to be careful where I'm painting. I'm getting it where it's not supposed to be. Got to watch where the edge of the, well, that's not good. And where the edge of the, see, this is going to end up on the blooper reel. I'm going to end up with a little bit of paint there that's actually gone outside of the masking, and I don't really want that. So I'm going to pause the video right now and try and fix that. Well, that's going to definitely end up on the blooper reel, and my attempts to clean it up have actually made it worse, so I'm going to stop with that. Really, if you can see, I've got the masking tape going up here and along there, and I actually just painted in that little corner there, and then trying to clean it out, I've actually spread the paint further along the fuselage. So we'll have to see how we can fix that later. It's fixable, I'm sure it is. So I'm going to stop talking and finish painting just without words.